Okay. Well, today, of course, we begin. Turn this off. Today, of course, we begin our look at the novel Atonement, which I have the published version here. And we read for today the first 2 chapters. And of course, this is the day when we also begin our dreaded prep sheets. So the way the format of our class will work is I'm going to talk about some of the ideas, some of the important quotes that I picked out from the text and explain what is happening, some of the things that are important about how to read this story. And then I'm going to ask you what are some of the things that you picked out while you were reading it, right? So tell me which page, which sentence, which part of the story you thought was important and why. Right? So this is what you wrote down in your homework, in your prep sheet. Okay. So we read, of course, the first 2 chapters of this novel. And you'll notice it's not just, even though it's the first 2 chapters, that there are further divisions in the book because this is part 1, right? So part 1 is divided into chapters. As we'll see, parts 2 and 3 actually don't have chapters. And at the very end, there is what's called an epilogue, which means like the ending of the story. Now, some of you might have read this book before. Come on in. Some of you might have read this book before. Some of you might have seen the film. And there are lots and lots of twists and turns and new things that are revealed along the way. So if you do already know the story, or if you do already know things that are going to happen, please don't spoil it for other people who are reading this for the first time, right? So at this point, right, if you do know what's going to happen later on, or if you do have knowledge of how the story is told that is important for later on, just pretend we've only read the first 2 chapters, all right? Please do that so that don't spoil the story for others. Okay. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of knowledge about some of the British terms that McEwen uses in the course of our reading for today, because occasionally, because he's British, and many of you, especially if you're growing up in the Korean system, most of you have probably had teachers of English who are from North America, Canadian, or American. And some of their terms, some of their English is going to be different to what the terms that the British people use, right? So I just want to explain a little bit some of these terms that you may not be familiar with. So first of all, on page 10 of our course packet, they use the term coming down, right? And this is a very peculiar term that is used with regard to both usually Oxford or Cambridge universities. And it means when you leave there, right? Either for the end of the semester, or in this case, because they're talking about Robbie, he's just graduated from Cambridge, right? So it means that he has just come down, means that he has just graduated from there in this case. All right. Today, when we think of wireless, we think of wireless internet, but in this case, as we'll see, this is before wireless. This story is told before wireless internet was invented, before the internet was invented, and so it actually means a radio in this case. All right. Also, with regard on that same page, page 11 of our packet, when Robbie we're told that at Cambridge he got a first, means that he got the highest score, the highest grade possible, right? Sort of like graduating in the American system with, a summa cum laude or something like that, right? Very high grade, right? Whereas we see Cecilia did not do so well and she graduated with a 3rd, right? So it's sort of like a ranking, sort of like an A, B, C, or first class, second class, third class degree, right? It's your average grade. So Robbie, obviously very smart and got a 1st at Cambridge. And then on page 14, there's the reference to the old man, and this is the slang, British slang for your dad, right? So the old people, sometimes be used as slang for your parents. It's not very respectful, but and something you probably wouldn't say to their face, but can be used in a sort of joking way as slang. It's usually it's not meant to be rude, it's just sort of affectionate. Right? So, oh, the old man. Right? Okay. So, as we begin to look at this story and we think about how it's told, one of the key things about reading any novel, and particularly modern novels that are written today, they tend to focus our attention very much upon how they are told, right? How they're told. In particular, this novel gets us to ask a lot of questions about what we might call perspective, or also the voice of the story, right? When we come to pick up a story, when we start to read it for the first time, we have different reactions to the way the characters are portrayed, the way the story is told, depending upon how the story is narrated, right? When a story is told to us in first person, I did this, I did that, then we tend to immediately react and think, it's possible that this person is a little bit biased towards themselves, right? Because it's natural. Whenever we tell our own story, whenever we narrate our own version of events, we can't help but have some sort of bias in the way that we tell a story, right? Whereas a story that's told in third person is usually seen as more reliable, more distant, right? Very often the third person narrator is presented as what is called an omniscient, all-knowing narrator. They know everything that's going on. Right? It's almost like they sort of have a godlike perspective, and they can see inside the thoughts of the characters. They can see things that, even though they are not there, right? So, when we see in chapter 2, we see Cecilia, right? We see inside her mind. We see what she's doing. Is there anyone there following her around? No, right? But the narrator is somehow able to see all these things and to know these things about what's going on in Cecilia's head and what she's doing and what she's thinking and what she's feeling, all right? So these two chapters that we've read so far, what voice, what perspective are they told from? Third person, right? So the story begins told in third person. It's told from this perspective of this omniscient narrator, all-knowing narrator, who can tell us everything that's going on in the characters' heads, their thoughts, their feelings, what they're doing, even when they're not being observed. All right? Okay. So this is always an important thing. Whenever you start reading a story, think about what voice it's written in, what perspective it is written from, because that always gets us to think about, well, where is the bias? Is it first person? Oh, I'm not sure whether I completely believe this narrator sometimes, right? So if you've read, for example, some very famous unreliable narrators, like Edgar Allan Poe's narrator in The Telltale Heart, his famous story, in which he says, oh no, I'm not crazy. I killed someone, but I'm not crazy. And we think, oh, I'm not sure if I believe this guy. I'm not sure if I really believe that he is completely sane. Right? Whereas third person, we tend to take it on faith that they are knowing and that they are objective. So chapter 1 and chapter 2, we see have also a different focus, right? That the perspective of the narrative, even though it's a third person narrative, does change in those first two chapters, right? Chapter 1, the focus is very much upon Bryony Tallis, right? The story is told from her perspective, mostly her thoughts, her activities, what she thinks, how she approaches things, how she views her cousins, how she views her family, and so on, right? Chapter 2 switches that perspective. And now we have Cecilia and her thoughts and her views and her conversations with Robbie and her activities, right? So even though we have a third-person narration told from the outside, nonetheless, it does choose a particular perspective or focus in each of these two chapters, and we'll see that as the chapters of part one go along, that this continues, that we see the narrative switches back and forth between different characters and different perspectives on the story. Okay. Now, I'm going to focus most of my attention in this little part upon Bryony, right? And I want to think about the way in which McEwen sets up her character. Right? Now, Bryony is an interesting character because she is someone who is sort of between adult and child. How old is she? 13, right? So she's just right about that age where, you know, she's starting to mature, her body is changing, she's starting to go through puberty, becoming a teenager, but at the same time, she's still very young. She still doesn't know a lot of things about the world, right? And so she is sort of at this in-between stage where she's starting to be interested in adult things, but she still doesn't have an adult understanding of the world, right? And so we see this little quote here. I've put here, when you look at these pages here, this is the page from the published version, from here, and the second number is the page from our course packet. Right? So on the first page of our story, we see that Bryony does she have any brothers or sisters? Yes, of course. We see Cecilia is her older sister, right? Anyone else? Right? She has an older brother too, right? Leon, who is coming home, right? So we see that she has these other brothers and sisters, and so in the family order, where does Bryony come? She's the youngest, right? So in this quotation that we see, this is looking at it from the perspective of Bryony's mother, Mrs. Tallis, right? And she's thinking about her children, and she's thinking about how Bryony is sort of her last baby, right? Her last child. It says, that hot, smooth little body, she remembered from she being Mrs. Tallis, she remembered from its infancy, and still not gone from her, not quite yet, right? So when she holds her daughter in her lap, when she hugs her daughter, right, Mrs. Tallis says, she's still just a child, right? Her body hasn't developed yet. She's still not a teenager. She still hasn't started to fully grow up yet, but she almost is, right? So she's on that line, that threshold, just between being grown up and being a child still. All right? So she certainly is interested in adult things, increasingly interested in adult things, as we see in this chapter. But she is at an age and also living at a time probably where she doesn't fully understand those things just yet. All right. When is this story set? Remember we said this novel was published in 2001. Is the story set in 2001? No. When is it set? It is, but we're not told just yet. We're given little clues, right? We're given little clues, right? There's no mobile phones, there's no internet, there's no computers, right? But we are given little historical clues, such as the references to the war and to the armistice, which is World War I, right? So actually, in this novel that we're reading at the time, World War II hasn't happened yet, right? So we're between those two war years, and later on we will find out it's 1935, right? So remember, that also plays a part in the way in which the characters think about themselves and their place in history and how their place in society. Because 1935, even though it's only some 80 years ago, it's still a lot of things have changed in society since then. Okay. Now, one of the main ways in which Bryony's immaturity is portrayed to us in this first chapter is in the way that she views marriage and sexuality, right? She sort of has this vague idea that people get married for some sort of reason, right? There must be some purpose to it, but for her, she's not entirely sure. Why would people get married, right? And this is reflected, for instance, in the way in which she views the divorce of her cousin's parents, right? Her aunt, remember, has gone off and left her husband, right? And has gone off to France with her lover. Well, maybe we haven't found out about this yet, but there's a divorce that's going on because of the cousin's parents, right? And Bryony is just like, she has no idea what a divorce means. She really doesn't have any idea what a marriage is for, right? So she doesn't have any real deep idea about what sex is, about what marriage is for, about how children are born, right? All of these things that are adult, and yet she has some sort of vague idea that there is some sort of connection to the adult world through marriage. So let's take a look at this quote first. She vaguely knew that divorce was an affliction, but she did not regard it as a proper subject. In other words, a subject that you're supposed to talk about. And gave it no thought. It was a mundane unraveling that could not be reversed and therefore offered no opportunities to the storyteller. It belonged to the realm of disorder. Marriage was the thing, or rather, a wedding was, with its formal neatness of virtue rewarded, the thrill of its pageantry and banqueting and dizzy promise of lifelong union. A good wedding was an unacknowledged representation of the as yet unthinkable, at least for Bryony, right? Sexual bliss, right? So here, McEwen's saying here, she doesn't know the connection between marriage and sex, right? In the aisles of country churches and grand city cathedrals, witnessed by a whole society of approving family and friends, her heroines and heroes reached their innocent climaxes and needed to go no further. In other words, they got married, and that was the end. No sex, no children, nothing, beyond that, right? So because Bryony just doesn't know about those things. She's not adult enough. Doesn't have the knowledge to know about them, right? So we see, from an adult perspective, this contrast is a little bit strange, because in the first part, when she's talking about the divorce, right, she says, divorce, yeah, that's boring, just things didn't work out, right? Whereas, of course, from an adult perspective, divorce has a much bigger sort of emotional impact, doesn't it, right? It has a lot of pain and suffering and so on associated with it. But Bryony's, that stuff is boring, who cares about divorce? Why would anyone want to write about that? She says, marriage, and not just marriage, but like not the actual everyday real marriage, but weddings, celebration. That's what matters to her. Okay. Now, remember I said to you that sometimes when we see references in a text, they're easy to spot because the author tells us the name of the author, the name of the book that they're thinking about, the title of the story, right? But you notice that I've bolded a couple of words there. And that's because they are a reference, right? A reference to a famous novel, perhaps the most famous novel of the 18th century, but one of the most famous, by the name of Pamela. And you can see Pamela is the main title. The subtitle is, or Virtue Rewarded. Virtue Rewarded. Right? So look at that again. So she talks about marriage here, form of virtue rewarded, Pamela, or virtue rewarded. Okay? Now this story was published in 1740, and it caused a huge stir. It was a big bestseller. It was one of the most famous books of its time. Everyone loved it and hated it, but everyone read it, right? It was like one of those, those big Hollywood blockbusters that everyone sees at some point, right? So this was the big book that everyone was talking about. And the basic plot has to do with these two characters, as you can imagine. Pamela, who is a servant, right? She's a middle-class woman, servant, serving in the house of an aristocrat, Mr. B. Right? We're not told his full name, Mr. B, he's known as, right, to protect his identity. Because Richardson pretends like this is a real story, that he found the letters between these two people that they wrote between each other and between their friends, and he has published them as this real account. Of course, it's all fiction. It's all made up. Right? So Pamela tells the story of how Mr. B, who is, in what is the term of the 18th century, is a rake. In other words, he is a womanizer, he sleeps with lots of women, and he has no morals, right? And he wants to do the same thing to Pamela, right? He falls in love with, well, first he falls in lust with Pamela, and she refuses him. He's like, I don't care if you're my employer. I don't care. Doesn't matter what you try to do to me, how you try to manipulate me. Put a ring on here, or I'm not going to marry you, right? And so for 500 pages of long letters and writing and turmoil back and forth, eventually Mr. B is so exhausted by Pamela and so worn down by her case that eventually he gives in and he marries her, right? And so, of course, she goes from being a middle-class, lower middle-class servant to being the wife of a rich aristocrat, right? So her virtue is rewarded. She has a husband, she's rich, she's upper class, because she stayed true to her pure virtues. All right? Now, you might be saying, oh, well, that sounds a bit strange, this bit questionable, this love story. It doesn't sound like she was necessarily in love with him. And even writers and thinkers at this time had the same idea. Because immediately after Pamela came out, it was a huge hit. A number of parodies and satires and arguments against Pamela were created. You can see here one by Eliza Haywood called The Anti-Pamela, or Feigned Innocence Detected. In other words, feigned means fake, right? Fake innocence. And so she basically portrays her version of Pamela as being someone who, from the very beginning, uses her body, her sexuality, her status as a woman to try and seduce Mr. B, right, and get him to marry her. So she wasn't doing it for love, she was doing it for her own selfishness and just pretending, oh yes, I'm so innocent, right? Oh, please rescue me from my status as a servant. Right? And similarly, Henry Fielding, and you may recognize these names from our reading, wrote two versions, a longer version called Joseph Andrews in the original novel by Richardson. Pamela's last name is Andrews. And more damningly, Shamala. Shamala, like sham meaning fake. Right? So Pamela becomes fake Pamela, Shamala. Right? So these novels, right? These three novels that I've put up here. We have here, beginning with Pamela. Pamela is supposed to be this symbol of innocence. Right? Innocence means you don't know what you're doing. You're just innocent. You're ignorant of what's happening. Right? And these other two make the opposite argument that, come on, Pamela, she's not really that innocent. She knew what she was doing, right? She knew that what she was doing was to her own advantage and was self-serving in the way that she went about getting to Mr. B. Right. So remember I said to you there's always, when a author chooses to put in a reference, they're always doing it deliberately. They want us to compare what is happening in their story to what is happening in these other stories, right? And so this question, as we see with these three novels, particularly you can see it in the title of Haywood's story, is Pamela really all that innocent? Is she really all that virtuous? It's been a debate that's gone back and forth about Richardson's work for a long time, right? For nearly 300 years. And it's something that, in turn, McEwan is getting us to think about with regard to Bryony, right? Here she is. She's someone who is just on the threshold of being an adult. How innocent is she really? Does she know what she's doing? Doesn't she know what she's doing? Right? Does Pamela know what she's doing when she eventually seduces and marries Mr. B? Or is she really an innocent? Well, that's hard to decide, right? It's a debate that can go back and forth. Is Bryony fully innocent? The way that she treats people, the way she thinks about her world, right? How innocent is she really? Right? How much of a child is she? How much of an adult is she? And how much responsibility does she have for her actions? Right? So this little reference, even though it's a small one and it's a very hard one to pick up, if you haven't ever heard of these novels before, that's why you have a professor to help you, is there in that quote, right? The reference helps us to think about this question. How innocent is Bryony really? And it's hard to tell, right? Just as it's hard to tell with Pamela, it's hard to tell with Bryony, right? And it's something that we have to detect and think about as we go along. Even readers and fans of Pamela weren't always sure about this. Joseph Highmore did a series of 12 paintings about Pamela. And you can see here again, Pamela and Mr. B, they're in the summer house in this case, right? And it's again one of the scenes where Pamela is like, no, Mr. B, I couldn't possibly. You have to marry me first. But look over here. I want you to keep this in mind for when we begin chapter 3. Look, there's someone looking in here at this scene and wondering, what is going on between these two people? Are they in love? Is she going to refuse him? What is happening? So I want you to think about this, right, as well as when we come to our next reading. Okay, one other thing that McEwan gets us to think about with this reference back to Richardson is that one of the central arguments that is made by Richardson and many writers of the 18th century, although not all of them, is this idea that our virtue, being good, always brings us rewards, just as being bad will lead us to being punished. All right? Is that true in real life? Do all good people have everything always goes right for them? Bad people always get punished? Well, we see things in life are a bit more complicated than that, aren't they? Because it's true. Often, if we're good, sometimes good things do happen to us. But not always, right? Sometimes the good things we do we feel like we get punished for being good. Sometimes we look around us and we see the people who are rich, who are powerful, who are successful, and say, they're not good people, right? They're bad people. Why aren't they being punished? Right? Because we see, in reality, there's not a one-to-one connection between those two things. And this is something that McEwan himself is looking to challenge within the novel, right? He's going against this long-standing idea or this long fascination in the British novel with this idea of what's called moral reward, right? If you're good, you get rewarded. If you're bad, you get punished. Right? It's something that we're very used to when we read literature or when we watch a film, right? We expect the bad guy is going to lose. We expect the good guy is going to survive and flourish. Right? McEwen, he's much more interested in these adult ideas. Right? So for him, the adult idea is facing the reality that sometimes, very often even, the connection between whether we're good or bad doesn't have anything to do with how successful or unsuccessful we are in life. Okay, so what we see in this first chapter is that there are a lot of moments when we see into the character of Bryony. We see some of the judgments and some of the values that she has about the world, but they all tend to be quite immature, childish, right? Childish views of the world that are even contradicted very often in that first chapter. Let's look at some of them, right? The first one, she decides that love's pretty simple, right? Love, you've just got to be smart, right? If you choose your love wisely, don't go with your passion, just choose with your head, then you can never make a mistake in love, right? None of us have ever made a mistake falling in love, right? Never, right? Because we all choose wisely, and we know that if we choose wisely, we can never, right? Of course not. We all, even when we use our head, even when we think, oh, yep, this will work out, sometimes it doesn't, right? And this is remember, this is the message that is told in her play, the Trials of Arabella. The play told a tale of the heart whose message, conveyed in a rhyming prologue, was that love did not build a foundation on good sense, was doomed. The reckless passion of the heroine Arabella for a wicked foreign count is punished by ill fortune. Right? So here we see Bryony subscribes to this idea of moral reward, right? Bad guys get punished, good heroines get rewarded, right? And also this idea that, oh, well, you can just control the world by the way in which you think, by the way in which you behave. If you're good, you can force the world to be good back to you, right? If you're bad, you force the world to punish you. Secondly, we see that as a child, and remember, children are very often like this, children think that they're in charge, that they can run the world, that they can run the household, they can provide the food, they can pay the electricity bills, they can, drive to work or to school every day. Without, they don't need you as parents. No. Right? Of course, this is not quite true. But for Bryony, she has this perspective that as a child, she is in charge, that she is the one who should run everything. And of course, we see that she's sort of allowed this indulgence by her family. Her family is like, oh, that's so cute, right? Oh, she's written a story. Oh, she's written a play, right? Let's allow her to do this. So she gets allowed by her family to have this state of mind where she feels like she is powerful and in charge through her imagination, through what she is creating. Right? And we see that even more in her mind, in her imagination, she believes that she can almost, like, through her imagination, control the world around her. Right? Let's look at this quote. She says, her passion for tidiness was also satisfied, for an unruly world could be made just so, right? Things that she doesn't like, fix them just like that. A crisis in a heroine's life could be made to coincide with hailstones, gales, and thunder, whereas nuptials were generally blessed with good light and soft breezes, right? Oh, my heroine's doing something I don't like. Ah, here's a storm. Oh, she's doing something I do like. Oh, here's some sunlight. As if she can just control the world that easily. A love of order also shaped the principles of justice, with death and marriage the main engines of housekeeping, the former being set aside exclusively for the morally dubious, the latter a reward withheld until the final page. So these ideas, that she can just control things, that she can impose order upon the world, that she can make everything conform to a system of justice that she wants to see, right? She thinks that because she can do these things in her childish imagination, that she can also do them in the world, right? And this often turns out to be something that is not true. Right? Lastly, out of these views, she talks about beauty, right? Beauty, she had discovered, occupied a narrow band. Ugliness, on the other hand, had infinite variation. And she is very sort of almost mean to her cousin Lola, right? Because she's, oh, her freckles are ugly, right? And basically says, oh, well, you know, a good person is also a beautiful person, is her childish perspective. Can evil people be good looking? Can they be beautiful? Yeah, of course they can, right? But here she has this prejudice, just like you'll see in many Disney movie, for example, right? Bad characters, they're always ugly, aren't they? Right? Good characters are always beautiful. So there is this prejudice here, this childish prejudice equation that she makes between beauty and being good, ugliness and being evil, that is also very childish in the way that she thinks about it. So to summarize this view that she has, these are the things that she sees about her world that are childish. She sees the world should be tidy, ordered, just like she wants it to be, right? I want it to be this way. I want it to be ordered just like I want it. It must be just, right, as long as she's in charge of what is defined as being just and fair. Right? She wants it to be ruled by rational principles, as long as she decides what's rational. And where she thinks that goodness, being good, is only exercised as she sees it by what she thinks are beautiful, good-looking people. All right. Now, even in this chapter, we see that many of these principles that Bryony thinks by and lives by are already being undermined. They're already being challenged by the way in which McEwen is telling his story, right? And we see it in particular by the difference between the way in which she constantly thinks about how she's going to put on this play, right? So the first half of the chapter, she's like, all right, this is how I wrote the play. Then we get given some background about Bryony and how she thinks about the world, and she starts thinking about like who's going to play the different parts and how it's going to work and how the family's going to love her for this play. And then the twins and Lola show up, right? And we move from her imagination of how the play will work to the reality of how the play actually works. We move from how Bryony imagines the world to work to start to see how the world actually in reality works, right? So we have this contrast, imagination, reality. Which one is more important? Which one is more real? Which one do these principles work in? So we start to see that her black and white, easy definitions, for example, between right and wrong, when she chooses the twins to play the different parts. Wait a minute, the bad guy looks exactly like the good guy. Well, because they're twins. But of course, McEwen does this for a symbolic purpose, right? Is that he's deliberately messing with Bryony's easy division between right and wrong, between good and evil. And even one of the twins says, I want to be the bad guy. I don't like being the good guy. I want to be the bad guy. All right? I want to be a bad person. All right? So Bryony's imagination, how she imagines this world that she supposes that she can control, that is just, that follows her principles, that is rational, we see is challenged by the reality of the actual world around her, right? That we see that the twins, Lola they come in and they provide a counterpoint, they provide an example that goes against all of these very childish ways. And particularly as we see, as the story goes along in this part 1, we see that Lola, in particular, Bryony, we said, is 13. Lola is 15, right? And so even though there's only 2 years between them, we see that Lola, she's not as close to, like the twins are only 7, right? So they're still very definitely children, right? Bryony, at 13, she's sort of somewhere in between. She's still young enough to play with the twins, but she's starting to be old enough to think about adult ideas and themes and want to see herself more as an adult. But Lola, 15, oh, that's a little bit, those 2 years extra mean that she seems to be much more knowledgeable, much more mature, even though she's just 15. But certainly compared to 13, she seems more knowledgeable and more adult about the world than Bryony. Okay? Okay. So, I'm going to leave this presentation there, and then because I want to turn now to our prep sheets and see what are some of the ideas that you guys wrote down as that you thought were important as you were reading this story. I haven't talked about chapter 2 at all, so certainly there are plenty of points from there that we can talk about, but also if you want to come back to chapter 1 as well and talk about Bryony as well, that's up to you as well. Okay, so for next time, we will be reading, let's see, pages 17 to 34 in our packet. Which means chapters 3, 4, and 5 of part 1. So just like we did for this time, please read those pages again. Create the prep sheets. Remember, they don't have to be beautiful. They don't have to take a long time. Right? Just make a note of which parts you think are important and write down very briefly 1 or 2 sentences why you think they're important. And of course, now that we're finishing, please hand those prep sheets in, and they go towards your overall grade for the semester. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. I'll see you on Monday.